What? My name is Sam, joined by Alex.
Hi.
How are you doing, Alex?
Yeah, good.
And we are very pleased to be joined by Jess Thorne, who is the archivist at the new Stuart Christie Memorial Archive, which we're going to be discussing today. They've got a fundraiser going on. It's still going on. It's just past its threshold of £10,000, but it turns out that the fundraising website takes a lot of money, so they still need your support. It's a really exciting archive. We're going to be talking about who Stuart Christie was in this episode. The link is in the show notes to the archive. Go and donate anything you can.
But also, if you raise another 5k, then that's an extra 5k to do cool stuff. So you should.
Yeah, exactly. We also, we've spoken about this internally, those that are involved, that if there's surplus funds, we want to give that money to sort of groups that Stuart would have been sympathetic to, sort of prisoner support groups and whatnot. So we're not just going to sit on that money. We do want to do actually socially useful and important things with it.
So you're not just contributing to the Mayday Millions, but
if only the Mayday Millions existed. Those of us involved in doing the crowdfunder aren't massively experienced in running crowdfunders. It feels like a bit of a stab in the dark. But so we got to sort of 10,000, but actually realised that GoFundMe take commissions, so we weren't actually at 10,000. We were just below. But now I think it's 11,300 and something.
Great stuff.
So yeah, just incredible. I think all of us that are sort of involved, which includes Stuart's daughter and close friends and family, are just kind of gobsmacked. I mean, we knew how much Stuart was admired, but I think it's particularly grim times at the moment. What with government mismanagement of the pandemic, and we thought that would people reach in their pockets for an archive right at this moment? But yeah, they did, and it just. Thanks doesn't seem enough, really. It's just, I keep saying, "Oh, thanks so much," but it's hard to put into words, I think.
And it's not over, right? So you can still donate. There'll be a link in the show notes as well to the donation page. We are, of course, talking about the Stuart Christie Memorial Archive, which is going to be based out of Mayday Rooms in London. It's on Fleet Street. It's a really great kind of archival space in general, but this is a really kind of exciting addition to the many archives they have there. And we're talking about Stuart Christie. So people who don't know who Stuart Christie was, just kind of, we'll go into his life in much more detail over the course of this episode. But tell us just kind of a broad overview, who was Stuart Christie and why is there a memorial dedicated to him?
So, I mean, to give a very brief summary, we can go into detail later. Stuart was kind of one of the major figures of post-war British anarchism. He kind of propounded, I guess, what you would call a class struggle based anarchism, I guess, opposed to sort of the Bookchin critique of sort of a more lifestyle sort of anarchism. It's quite a sort of old school anarchism based on the syndicalism of the CNT, the anarcho-syndicalist trade union in Spain. And it was on the issue on Spain, which I guess Stuart found sort of notoriety on and became,
to say the least, yes.
Yeah, he almost got celebrity status in Britain for a while because of the action that he took. So in 1964, in the summer of 1964, he made a trip to Paris where he met loads of sort of anarchist Spanish exiles. And from there, he picked up a package which included these sort of French-made plastique explosives that he was then going to deliver to another anarchist in Spain, and he crossed over the Pyrenees by foot, got to a bar where this handover was supposed to happen, and it's quite obvious that he had been followed the entire way, and he got into this bar, and things just didn't seem right. It's almost like a scene in a Western where everyone turned round and was like waiting for this event to unfold. So he stepped outside and felt a gun in the back, and basically the Guardia Civil saying, terrorist. So he was arrested for 3 years. When he came out, when he came out of prison in Spain, he set up the Anarchist Black Cross for Spanish anarchist prisoners, and that's probably, I guess, in terms of like his legacy, one of the longest lasting. There's still Anarchist Black Cross groups that are active, I guess, more so in the States and the UK, perhaps because of just the sort of the nature of the casteral system over there. So he was kind of, really his importance is that he ended up connecting basically the sort of the anarchism in Spain, that sort of golden period of anarchism, but also kind of like tragic defeat, with a kind of new generation of radicals in the 60s, like the generation around 68. So he became this kind of conduit, really, and ended up, translating loads of materials from Spain that otherwise would have been completely inaccessible. I mean, loads of those materials are, they're on undergraduate reading lists now. So, he has a really, really important legacy, and across like really diverse terrains as well.
Yes, great. So as you said, most kind of, I guess, infamous or famous or celebrated or hated for his part in a kind of plot essentially to assassinate Franco, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, I think that's probably that's the most spectacular sort of detail of his life. But then he also, because of his involvement in Spain and his connection with Spanish anarchists, he also ended up getting caught up in what became one of the longest criminal trials in English history, which was the trial of the Angry Brigade, which was this urban guerrilla group which sprang up in the late 60s, who had this kind of, they probably wouldn't have described themselves really as anarchists. They had, lots of the members of this group came out of the more sort of libertarian, socialist left, sort of new left, and were kind of like radicalized by that experience. Some of them also met Spanish anarchists in London and were kind of, they saw these kind of very committed revolutionaries that had these, like fascinating life stories, and were inspired by that. So Stuart ended up getting caught up in the trial of the Angry Brigade because of his link with Spain, and basically lots of the targets of the Angry Brigade include like Spanish embassies, US embassies, also included like very weird targets, including the like banks and stuff. So it had this very kind of like libertarian, socialist, sort of new left feel. But he basically got caught up in this because of his link, his connection to Spain, and also what was, I guess, quite key was that one of the guns, the police were investigating a series of attacks that were occurring in London in the late 60s on Spanish embassies, and apparently, according to police reports, one of the guns used in these attacks was later found at a commune in, I think, Hackney. And that's where the supposed members of the Angry Brigade were sort of all hanging out. And they thought that Stuart was the connection. They basically thought Stuart was importing these revolutionary continental ideas into conservative Britain. And in some ways he was, but he wasn't in the way that they were accrediting him. I
always find it really fascinating, both in the history of British anarchism and in the history of British anti-fascism, that both anarchism and fascism are conceived of as like strictly non-British imports, right? So people refer to, for example, even now people refer to, say, like Tommy Robinson, who's obviously not a Nazi. They refer to him as like a Nazi in order, in some ways, to like make it seem like it's a thing that comes from outside Britain. And Britain is treated as this place with basically no political ideas apart from liberalism, and therefore everything else that's outside of that must be some sort of strange foreign import. But one of the things we were mentioning just before we started recording was this connection between Christie's kind of formative period in growing up in Glasgow in the 50s and 60s, and his grandma. The title of his autobiography is "Granny May Be an Anarchist." He has another kind of part of his memoir, which is "Franco Made Me a No." What's that one called? Franco Made Me a Terrorist, and Ed Heath Made Me Angry.
Angry, yeah.
Which just somehow is like just a very it's obviously very funny. But yes, what can you tell us some more about his kind of his political journey to the point at which, at the age of I think 18, right, you cross over into France and then hitchhike to Spain in order to blow up Franco, right? This is quite like a strange childhood. It's a childhood I wish I'd had as well. Obviously, we've caught up from this in the past on SoundCloud, so I'm just going to say it now. The official position of 12 Rules for What is not that you should blow up fascist dictators. We've been slapped on the wrist by SoundCloud, so I'm going to just say that. Yes. How did he become the person who did this kind of like amazing thing?
I think that there were many different important sort of events and sort of trajectories which led him to take that quite sort of extreme action. Whenever you mention it to people, that particularly those in Spain that actually aren't aware of Stuart, they're just kind of like, why? Just totally amused why this person would do that. So I mean, I think so. He was raised in the Partick district of Glasgow, which was very like poor working class part of Glasgow. It's not the same anymore. I think it's been quite gentrified. And he was raised there, sort of in one of the old Edwardian tenements, and he says in, I think it's Granny Made Me an Anarchist, he talks about the kind of the community there and how basically he came into contact with, at least at the physical level, Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid, and he said that in the entrances of the tenements, basically, you'd have these congregations of mostly women, basically looking out for those in the tenements that had fallen ill or had just like facing various problems, and everyone would like crowd round and try and like resolve the problem or reach in their pockets or whatever. So this like sort of like working class community was really important for that. He then moves to Blantyre, which is this Scottish people are probably going to be like, that's not really how you say Blantyre, right? But
that's okay. The amount of like French that's been butchered and German that's been butchered on this podcast already, don't worry.
So he moves there, and Blantyre has a really interesting history and a really interesting and I guess in some ways unusual but not really surprising connection to Spain. So it was a mining town. And I think that the Communist Party was very present there. And basically 3 international brigaders came from Blantyre. And I think all of them died in battle actually in Spain. So they became like local martyrs. And Stuart grew up with this. He grew up with this history. And it would just be constantly spoken about. He would frequently sort of like go past like the Miners' Welfare Institute, and he would recall these sort of quite heated conversations about the civil war in Spain and whether what the communists did was counter-revolutionary, and it was just kind of like within the common parlance of like the local sort of left-wing community. It was kind of like you couldn't really escape it. So there was that as well. And also I think he came from an interesting family background in the sense that he was like mostly raised by his grandparents. And I think his grandmother, I think I always get this like mixed up, was like that came from a Protestant background, and his grandfather was Catholic. So obviously that was quite unusual at that time, like Glasgow and Blantyre's not too far from Glasgow, is quite sort of sectarian still. So I think some of the values that Stuart's grandmother sort of instilled in him were sort of, you know, kind of, I guess, sort of Christian ideals of like support and, you know, I think with very little resources, she always made sure that, you know, everyone was clothed and fed and stuff. So he kind of like grew up within, you know, this kind of, there were like anarchist sort of like tendencies there. They weren't obviously remotely even sort of organized or even sort of like enunciated really. But I guess when you're writing a memoir and you're trying to sort of join various stories together, you know, it becomes like a bit of a sort of like a telos. It's like you have, well, everything surely had to lead to this moment sort of thing. So yeah, there was a mixture of you know, family and like local geography. And I guess what's also interesting about Blantyre is that it's a mining community, and in 1962, so Stuart would have been 16, 17, there were these huge, quite successful strikes in Spain, in Asturias, which was another mining region. And that was constant, that was in the press and in the international press quite a lot. So Stuart would have been looking at that. I think he also had a teacher that was a kind of, I guess, quite sort of middle of the road socialist. And that's actually where Stuart first, that was where he went first, was socialism. He joined the Independent Labour Party. But I think that the other events in the 60s sort of basically made it clear that sort of the road of the Labour Party was not one to go down, and that actually, you know, the post-1945 social democratic arrangement had fallen short in so many ways, particularly in terms of, you know, authority on the shop floor and what the closer alignment of state and trade unions actually meant. Were workers actually empowered by this? So there were all these things going on. I mean, also the Cold War was had a major impact on Stuart, particularly with obviously sort of US military bases in Scotland, and you know, basically, you know, Holylock became potentially, it threatened with like nuclear annihilation. So that radicalized loads of young people in Scotland, Stuart very much included.
He becomes involved with the CND, right, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which, as far as maybe this is apocryphal, but like seems to become kind of important a bit later, when he's in jail in Spain, and there's a kind of international campaign for his release, which contains people like Bertrand Russell, who's of course very prominent in the CND, and even people like Sartre, which is just astonishing. And in the interviews I read with him, when this is kind of brought up, his kind of I don't know, convergence or kind of meeting with you know, people who are probably like the pre-war and post-war kind of like most prominent intellectuals in Europe. He's like, just kind of brushes it off. He's like, well, I have no idea why they're interested in me. You know, it's extraordinary kind of modesty kind of goes along with all these things. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that he formed, or was involved in the kind of the resuscitation or something like this of the anarchist Black Cross in the UK, which is kind of a militant version of Amnesty International. Which is like does kind of political support for political prisoners, including people who have been imprisoned for political crimes of violence, which Amnesty International, I think, as far as I can tell, kind of doesn't want to touch, like people who are kind of involved in that stuff. It's a really important organization, especially because politics necessarily includes violence. You can't kind of like remove it. I found a description, and I want to just like it was just an amazing description of this organization. So I just want to like read it out. So the activity is divided into two parts. The first part was to provide material support in the form of food parcels and medical supplies to people to Spanish resistance. Okay, fine. I can imagine food parcels, medical supplies. I can imagine that gets past most
seems
international.
reasonable to me, yeah.
Yeah, that seems fine. The second part is to like provide direct aid to the Spanish resistance movements, including, this is a great list, print duplicators, typewriters, and guns. So
it's quite an escalation, isn't there?
It is quite an escalation. Yeah, it's a real, yeah, it really zooms off at the end. So how did this support for the Spanish resistance work, and how was it able to get past, like, obviously international embargoes on arms dealing?
So I mean, the actual, there's not much. I mean, Stuart wasn't one for clarity when it came to actually how he conducted illegal activity, particularly in sort of, you know, the sort of anarchist Black Cross bulletins that you find at the time, because obviously they were being read by various security services, but also, you know, he didn't really, like, they didn't get away with it at all. The offices of anarchist Black Cross were raided. There was an office on is it Compton Street, the street opposite the British Museum? They had an office there, and it was raided by a special branch, and they were sort of looking for sort of various materials that would basically indict Stuart. All they found, I think, was what they thought was they said it was a fraudulent like $10 bill, but it was just a bit of like propaganda that Stuart had made and was going to give out at demos. It was quite obviously a fake, and then they tried to stitch him up for like trying to fraudulently make money. So yeah, he didn't really get away with it. In terms of, you know, there's loads of letters from Spanish prisoners that are sent into the anarchist Black Cross, which, you know, very grateful for, like the food parcels that are sent. Also, like medicines, like something that was really important in Franco's jails, because they were just so poorly like basic things like, you know, paracetamol, they just couldn't get really. But there was also, obviously, there were these kind of, you know, like connections to a new wave of Spanish resistance in the 60s, which began initially with a group called Defensa Interior, Interior Defense, which was set up by a Spanish exiled anarchist in Mexico, and he was called Octavio Alvarado, and he has a really interesting history. This is another one of like the fascinating connections that Stuart has. Octavio had a really interesting history. He was involved in basically the Cuban Revolution, and like worked in one of the propaganda groups alongside Castro and Che Guevara. And when he basically returned to Europe after the Cuban Revolution, a bit disillusioned with how that had sort of gone to turn out, but also thought that, you know, guerrilla tactics could perhaps be imported into Europe, and perhaps that could remove Franco dictatorship in Spain. So he basically brought together this disparate group of exiled anarchists who were committed to taking, you know, violent, direct action against representatives of the regime. Most of their targets were actually property, but obviously there was various assassination attempts of Franco, which all failed, obviously, not giving any spoilers there. So that organization ended up like winding up by sort of, but actually by the time that Stuart arrived in Spain, that organization had pretty much just been brutally repressed, and two of its members had been executed. So, you know, and Stuart would have been aware of this. What would happen is, you know, incredibly like brave path to take. And then, so this organisation wound up, and then sort of 67, 68, it gets kind of revived, but with a broader focus. It's now, you have this group called the 1st of May group. And there's various people said there's like connections between the 1st of May group and the Angry Brigade. And I think Gordon Carr, who's written this history of the Angry Brigade, I think is published by PM Press, he kind of indicates strongly that there was this like connection between the 1st of May group and then those that would go on to be involved in the Angry Brigade. So the Anarchist Black Cross ends up publicising a lot of the communiques that are coming in from the 1st of May group. So they'll claim an attack somewhere, and the Anarchist Black Cross will like publish what they've done. It's unclear how much funds perhaps maybe went to the 1st of May group, or if they even did. It seems perhaps likely that they probably did. But as I said, that the documentary trace of that is quite hard to find. Stuart he didn't really kind of want to talk about that. So it's understandable.
Yes. Yeah, totally understandable.
So just to talk a bit about the actual work of the archive, because obviously we talked a lot about Stuart's early life. He had a long career of publishing and archiving himself. Give it a sense of what this archive is. What's the kind of material that's in it, and what have you found particularly most interesting as the person working on or beginning to work on this?
Yeah, so much has come through in the process of just like initiating the call for support. When we first had the idea, we just had the material that Stuart's daughter had, that he left in the house, and most of that stuff, it includes sort of like print runs of Stuart had a publishing house which he set up with another quite important British anarchist called Albert Meltzer in the mid-70s, called Cienfuegos Press.
I'm so glad you said that, so I was trying not to say it. But
yeah, named after a Cuban anarchist. And they set up this publishing house, and it published and translated loads of texts on struggles in Spain and Latin America. So there's loads of print runs of that. It was like you get like it would have like a press review, and like they had these really beautiful artworks on the front that were designed by this Italian artist who I think had sort of anarchist sympathies, but was kind of a bit of an amorphous character, like most artists are. He called Flavio Constantini, and he did all the art for it. But we've also got some like posters, like original like posters that Flavio Constantini did. Also includes obviously like bits of correspondence, that we have letters from Stuart that he sent whilst he was in Spain. We have photographs as well of Stuart in prison, which didn't appear on Stuart's Facebook, which he kind of ended up using a bit like an archive sort of towards his later life. There's also there's lots of Stuart kind of didn't make things easy for us, so he kind of deposited things, I feel, a bit sort of on a whim, and some sort of archive initiative would come up and he'd be like, oh, I'll just put it there for a bit, and then he would take things back out. So yeah, he's incredibly I guess he probably wanted to keep us on our toes, but there's he donated I think quite a lot of material to the Kate Sharpley Library, and they've been incredibly generous and supportive of what we're doing, and they're hoping to get some of the material that is currently stored in California to us, so it can be with the archive. And yeah, they've been just so important for us and really, really useful. So it's kind of, you know, it's we're working with like various different sort of, you know, groups and individuals to get all of Stuart's material in one place, and to make it accessible, so to digitize it and make it available online, so people can actually use it. Yeah.
I mean, I think I've made this point on Twitter, and other people have made it, that there's often like kind of a break between the struggles of the past and the contemporary struggles, and like projects like archiving, and particularly archives of such importance and relevance to a really vital movement. You know, it's really useful and, you know, vital to have accessible and there and collated and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
definitely. I think, you know, it's really interesting. I was looking through an interview that Stuart did, I think in 2004, and he kind of says, he's kind of reflecting on his participation in sort of armed struggle in the 60s and 70s and other groups at the time. And he kind of says, well, you know, it happened 30 years ago, that the strategies and tactics that were useful then don't really apply now, sort of thing. So I think that's what's interesting about Stuart, is I don't think, you know, some anarchists that you come across can be like incredibly dogmatic, and, you know, think one tactic or strategy is, you know, this trans historical path that like you have to go down, and it's this way, or there's no way, sort of thing. And obviously, like, Stuart's full of conviction, and, you know, there were certain convictions which you obviously, you know, wouldn't be challenged by, like, at all. But I think in terms of tactics and strategy, that he was always, you know, willing to be open. He was involved in throughout his life, he was involved in so many different sort of social movements, that he ended up like accumulating sort of all of these tactics and strategies. So, you know, an archive really can, you know, an archive like this anyway can be like a repository of tactics and strategies for the contemporary left. Not that all of those tactics and strategies necessarily be useful now, but like nevertheless to compare what was useful then to what is useful now. This is a useful exercise. So yeah, I think even though Stuart made that remark that, you know, oh, it's 30 years ago, you know, we tried it then, wouldn't work now, I think he still would think that it's still necessary to like look at what he was involved in, even if it's to say, actually, this would fail now, this wouldn't work.
What was his kind of relationship to anarchism as it kind of, I guess, like became more contemporary, right? So there's a book called Towards the Militia. Not Towards the Militia, Towards Citizens Militia or something. Towards Citizens Militia, right? Which is obviously a very controversial book, because it's literally about like how you would.
I'm pretty sure it's illegal to own a copy of
right. Naturally, the archive does not possess a copy.
No,
but
no.
And 12 Rules for What is also against people, for strictly legal reasons, against people owning copies. And that's obviously a extremely controversial text. I guess the question is, like, how did Stuart approach the transformation of anarchism into the present day? I mean, in some ways you can see the 1964 event when he goes to Spain as already kind of an echo of the international brigades, 30 years before. Or maybe the question isn't really so much like how did he approach it, but like how do you think that his actions have echoed forward into anarchism, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that point that you made about sort of 1964 being like an echo of a kind of a generation that had sort of long been defeated. It felt like that sort of that moment in the 60s. It feels like the final death throes of that sort of revolutionary anarchism in the 30s. And I think there's obviously is it George Woodcock, who has written various histories of anarchism, basically claims that like by after the 1960s, it's just not really a kind of big movement anymore. I think Stuart, sort of as he gets old, obviously he ends up leaving London because it's no longer really safe for him. He keeps getting stitched up in various sort of like conspiracies, you know, the Angry Brigade trial. I think that was a thing that he was like, I need to kind of get out of this situation, otherwise I probably will end up with another prison sentence. So obviously he goes off to Orkney, and yeah, that's where he writes that the alternative to NATO, the citizens militia, which I think also then leads to like a visit from Special Branch again. I don't know how he quite sort of got out of that one either. He just must have been like extremely charming or something. I don't know. I just feel like obviously also it was a very different time. I think today, my God, if you were to do that, it just, you would stand no chance. But I think
the comparatively mild text, right? Like the Invisible Committee text, right? Towards the coming insurrection, comparatively mild, I would guess. I haven't read, obviously, because it's illegal, towards citizens militia, but I'm guessing that it doesn't simply kind of advocate for like minor property destruction on like French rail. But yes, you're absolutely right.
I think Stuart's response was like, but it, he kind of suggested it was this kind of almost like this like home guard, home front sort of thing. Like if there was to be this like collapse of, sort of society or some kind of war, how could we have our own home guard? I think that's how he kind of like passed it.
That's extremely canny.
Yeah, it is. It's great. But I think, as he I think remains involved in the Anarchist Black Cross for most of the 1970s, although the sort of the affinity group of the Anarchist Black Cross changes and different people are involved. And I think, sort of the 80s and 90s, he's mainly involved in publishing. So, I think he still has his ear to the anarchist movement, and also he still goes over to Spain a lot, and that remained a kind of a lifelong sort of love affair for him. I think he went over to Spain in the sort of late 70s when the CNT in Spain was sort of reconstructing itself, and then sort of in the sort of the 2000s and stuff like that, obviously he ended up writing lots like memoirs of his own life, and also created this really astonishing film archive, which we're trying to basically store on the Mayday Room server, because Stuart, he had a film archive. He paid for it to be hosted on a private server, but there's a danger of it just suddenly disappearing, and so that was the first thing we were like, we need to save this now before it all just like gets wiped, or the technology he used becomes like completely impossible and redundant to kind of preserve. So yeah, I think his he doesn't retire from anarchism, but he does take sort of, I guess, a bit of a back step from it, but also because, the anarchist movement in the 80s and 90s is there's various things going on, and you have, organizations like Class War and whatnot, but, it's not the movement that it was. I think that's like a pretty safe thing to say. It's, like the rest of the left, it's in a period of defeat. And you have like the years of Thatcher Blairers and all the rest of it. So I think Stuart would probably say sort of by the sort of 2000s that there probably wasn't really much of an anarchist movement to speak of in Britain. There were various social movements, and I guess you could look at things like the alter globalization movement and stuff like that as having sort of, I guess, anarchist sort of like tendencies, but it was never kind of concrete. And I guess like a lot of the sort of, I guess, more like contemporary anarchist movement, I guess it has like a slightly, in some sense, a slightly more like countercultural feel. Not that Stuart wasn't interested or fascinated by counterculture, but he was actually just one of the interesting things about him, like quite skeptical of the New Left, and thought that like it was a kind of quite sort of like campus middle class thing, and that it was kind of like a fad, and that the fascination with the situationists would soon, like, people would get over it, sort of thing. So he was.
Yeah, this was an illusion. Yes.
Yeah.
They did not get over it.
No. He was skeptical, and as I said, I think at the beginning, his idea of anarchism was a kind of based on a quite, I guess it seems quite old school now, but yeah, a class struggle anarchism. I
guess there's a kind of a tension in telling these stories between really exceptional individuals and what is obviously like a collective kind of movement. I wonder how that comes out in Stuart Christie's own writing about things. So he wrote We the Anarchists, so history of anarchism in Iberian Peninsula. I'm wondering, like, how does he tell those stories of the relationship between like exceptional individuals and like collective movements? How did he understand maybe his own place in that struggle or in that history?
Yeah, I think it's like that's always like a bit of a, to use a bit of a sort of wanky word, dialectical tension, isn't there, between the kind of like the individual and the collective, and that's a tension in anarchism, isn't it? You know, you have these two strands, this kind of individualist sort of strand and this collectivist strand. I know Stuart probably would have been accused in some ways actually of going down an individualist strand, you know, like going and taking this action sort of by yourself, and this quite sort of propaganda of the deed style thing. You know, he wasn't particularly, you know, that involved in sort of like, you know, like trade union conflicts or anything like, you know, it was a kind of quite adventurous sort of adventurous action that he did sort of his own volition. You know, there was no sort of committee or anything telling him what to do. I think he's actually like an incredibly really lucid historian. I think what's good about Stuart, and I think this is what's actually just generally good about most of the like historians that I think are worth respecting, is that, you know, it's very obvious that his cards are on the table, and it's very obvious what groups he has sympathies with, and what groups he doesn't have sympathies with, and what individuals he doesn't have sympathies with.
For example,
Franco, one of them, but also, you know, even those within sort of the inner life of the CNT, there's certain individuals which he doesn't necessarily blame for the, you know, total defeat of the anarchists, but also the Republic, the Spanish Republic, and the Civil War, but certainly thinks that they betrayed the movement. So I think he's particularly critical of this Spanish anarchist who's actually, she's, you know, in Freedom outside there's that like mural of anarchists that, yeah, it's actually like a really beautiful mural. I think she's on that, Federica Monsen, and she was like I think health minister or something within the Spanish Republican government. But I should just say, by the way, the 1930s is not, I deal with the period when I'm sort of doing research, I deal with the period of defeat. The 1930s is not my area of expertise, but he was critical of her because she entered the government and then was kind of, you know, when the revolution happened, was quite quick to say, actually, no, like, you know, we need to support the effort to defeat fascism, and was quite quick to sort of renege on kind of more like revolutionary commitments. So, and he was intensely critical of her. She ends up taking like a really key leadership position in exile, and that whole, it's really interesting, that whole the CNT in exile actually has quite a stale feel to it. It's kind of, you know, it will have these like sort of frequent celebrations of the Spanish Revolution and whatnot, but there's no kind of discussion of or of strategy, like in the present, and like how might we return to Spain or any of that. So I think Stuart finds them quite difficult people to deal with. He's more attracted to the younger crowds of Spanish anarchists that belong to the Juventudes Libertarias, which were the libertarian youth section of the CNC. Although a funny fact about that is that actually most of the people that belonged to the libertarian youth section, like in the 60s, you had members of the libertarian youth section that were like in their mid-30s to 40s. Yeah, so
age is just a number, and
so yeah, I've lost what your actual initial question was. I feel like I've gone off down a rabbit hole talking.
That was great. Yeah, I mean, it was good. It was about, the original question was about the relationship to the individual and the collective in the way that he tells this story of Spanish anarchism. I think you're right that I mean, it seems like Spanish anarchism for everyone, including for me, forms a kind of like a romantic period to which there was like kind of a continuous desire to return, even if the details are, as they are definitely for me, not all that clear. So exactly like how you would, or what you would even be returning to. And I'm wondering like what you think the kind of what's the function of it in the kind of the wider anarchist movement. I mean, I guess like there's this kind of very sad kind of repetition that happens. You were talking about in the CNT, right? Like in the period of defeat, as you said, it becomes kind of stale and so on. There's kind of repeating, but without being able to like really kind of address it. And I wonder what kind of function you think that the period of, or either the Spanish anarchists themselves or the defeat of the Spanish anarchists forms in the kind of the imaginary international anarchism. Like, and is it really the kind of the waning of that romance that essentially marks off the kind of the death knell of international anarchism in the 1960s? Let's assume that thesis is correct.
I think it does. You know, I wouldn't go as far to say that, like, you know, the anarchist movement completely like is non-existent in sort of the 70s. It is, but it's kind of, you know, there's like it's at that period where there's a kind of like balkanization of the left, and you have like various different like anarchist groups and Maoist groups, and all very small splintered groups. I think that the danger, and this is actually what many sort of those that are sort of at the younger end of the CNC in the 50s and 60s, they kind of say that there's a danger here of, you know, the international anarchist movement being blindsided by the Spanish Revolution. You know, the conditions that were available to us then aren't now. We have to like face what's in front of us. And so, you know, there were various people in the CNC that were, you know, calling for alliances with like other oppositional groups, including those that, you know, had acted pretty abysmally towards anarchists during the Civil War. But many of these anarchists felt that there's little choice but to kind of just, you know, they were too small to do this by themselves. They needed to work with other oppositional groups. It's a kind of a paradox that Federica Monsen, who was one of the characters that Stuart was very critical of, she ended, despite having served in the Republican government, she made this really weird about-face turn, in it basically an attempt to maintain control of the CNC in exile, and said, like, no collaboration, like any collaboration is like complete counter-revolutionary, despite having done precisely that at the time, perhaps maybe when it mattered the most. So yeah, it does kind of, you know, it blindsides the international anarchist movement. I think, I mean, Guy Debord actually ends up writing, I think, in Society of the Spectacle, one of his theses is about, he talks about anarchism, and he basically says that, like, the problem with the CNC is that, like, it thinks that its only failure is that it was kind of betrayed by its leaders, sort of thing. And that probably was an important part. I think probably the Civil War would have been lost anyway, but I guess there's a conversation there to be had about how you lose. And do you lose with dignity, or do you lose with sort of compromise and whatever. But yeah, I think that defeat was kind of so colossal. It also occurred at a time, in the 30s, when the rest of the workers' movement in Europe had been smashed. I think the reason why the anarchist movement found it so hard after the war to kind of reconvene is that, it kind of been, lots of workers were for a time sort of kind of satisfied with sort of post-1945 arrangements. I guess the Communist Party had huge sort of social, cultural capital because of its role in sort of transnational anti-fascist networks during the Second World War. Obviously, Spanish anarchists also played an important part in that, but not as large to extent as the Communist Party. So I think they struggled with that. Obviously, the next sort of moment of opportunity was sort of the late 60s and the kind of the rupture with the post-war consensus. But it seemed like there was lots of kind of anarchist tendencies like circulating within like various movements at a sort of local national level, but they kind of failed to build sort of institutions really that would kind of keep these things going. I guess the anarchist Black Cross was different in that sense because it was an institution that was long lasting, and they did try and Stuart was keen to make it an organization that wasn't just a kind of sort of ambulance service for the left, like picking up prisoners and those that had like been brutally repressed by the state, but actually for it to be like a force for like combat as well, and a force for actually like changing things. So I think there were attempts made to be like anarchists did attempt to do that, but I think post 68 with like sort of continental wide state repression, so many groups just splintered, and I think I just feel like you which is not going to return to that kind of period of sort of mass mobilization that you had sort of in the 30s, which was seen as like, this is it, like we have to defend this because there is nothing left in like Europe. I mean, like fascism has completely destroyed the workers' movement. I guess, I mean, there is a kind of slight resurgence, particularly in Spain, of a kind of more like revolutionary syndicalism in the late 60s. Before that, the Communist Party in Spain had been actually quite successful at mobilizing workers in these like clandestine workers' assemblies. But in 67, the Francoist state basically makes it very clear that this kind of tactic of infiltrating what we'll call these vertical trade unions, this tactic was just not going to be tolerated, and they came down hard on the Communist Party. So like it was like it wasn't really a legalist strategy, but they were basically using the infrastructure of the vertical trade unions to subvert them, and that sort of grey legal zone was just closed down. So sort of this syndicalism, this revolutionary syndicalism and the legalism became sort of, returned, I guess, to Spain for a bit. But yeah, I mean, then you had the death of Franco and the transition and the pacts, and that's a whole different story. But
I have one question to ask about that story, which like after the transition, right, like the new constitution of Spain, but it's like written kind of with like a great deal of continuity and particularly like power for the army and so on. Like, but how do you see the contemporary far right in Spain? So the Vox party and so on. Like, how do you see those as related to the Franco Spain?
Yeah, I mean, many of them have, some of those that like hold leadership positions have direct connections to various Francoist ministers. I mean, there's obviously a very clear connection between, the Vox Party and Francoism. I think one of the electoral maps a couple years ago looked at voting patterns in Spain and where Vox came out strong. And unsurprisingly, it was in those areas which became Francoist very early on. So that the Francoism, as you know, that legacy is still there, and it's alive, and it's well. And you know, obviously, it's been great to see, you know, online recently. One of the last statues to Franco was removed, but I think, and that's great. I think, you know, public space is really important, and it's important for, you know, fascist dictators not to be revered. But I think it kind of perhaps neglects the extent to which Francoism is still alive in the army, the judiciary. You know, it's a deep structural problem, and one that, yeah, it explains that sort of moment of success for the Vox Party. And also, you know, I just think, I mean, it's interesting because the Vox are kind of like, I guess, you know, we didn't have social media during the Franco dictatorship, but they seem, I guess, a bit more sort of savvy, less sort of old-fashioned when it comes to, a bit more, yeah, sort of insurgent when it comes to sort of propaganda and stuff. But yeah, I mean, the issue of Francoism, like, it comes up again and again, and you see it in relation to, I guess, the stuff in Catalonia. You know, the kind of the response of sort of the authority of the state to that is just kind of, you can't really make sense of it without, you know, looking at what happened in the transition and the constitution, and how, you know, like keeping the community, the national community of Spain sort of together is like kind of sacrosanct, and any challenge is seen as like a kind of violent challenge. So yeah, I think, you know, statues, removing them, brilliant, but let's definitely widen the conversation and think about actually how we can transform institutions of power rather than just, you know, relics which, you know, still exude power and still, you know, still have to deal with these things. But I think, yeah.
Yes, it's extremely important.
Or abolish some of the institutions. I mean, you know, I don't. Yeah.
Yes, that's the other option.
So the archive just got started. It's had this big fundraiser, raised a lot of money. Where can people keep up with what you're doing, and how can they get involved if you want people to be involved?
Yeah, so I mean, we have like a Twitter and Facebook page. Both of the well, you don't have a handle on Facebook, do you? I'm such a granny when it comes to these things. But there's Archive Stuart. If you search on Facebook the Stuart Christie Memorial Archive, it will come up. But the Twitter handle is Archive Stuart, and we're using that to keep people updated. I think probably we would, you know, like to in some point in the future, in the near future, sort of have a sort of online event of some sort to talk about the archive, what we're doing with it, and, you know, invite people to contribute any ideas. I think, you know, we want everyone to have sort of their hands on the archive. It's not this kind of, you know, academic or sort of state archive thing where, you know, materials are preserved to basically hinder present use and, like, you know, keep it there and then wait until some like notional future generation that they haven't really thought about, like, comes and finds it, like some time capsule or something. So that's not what we want to do.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
Okay.
All hands on. So yeah, if people have ideas, it'd be great to hear from them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. Any last thoughts?
No, I guess just thank you to everyone that's donated so far. Like, it's just been, I don't think we really, 10k was a total stab in the dark for us. We came up with a number based on like how long we thought it would take to archive the stuff and things we wanted to do, and we were like, 10K. Is that reasonable? We don't. And
it turns out yes.
It turns out yeah, which is like is great. And now we can do it. Now we can just we can get on and do it, which is brilliant.
This has been 12 Rules for What. Hope you enjoyed the show. See you very soon. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Silver Threads, Still Walking, Still Waking is co-hosted by me, Carla Bergman.
And me, Eleanor Goldfield. This is where we interview long-term organizers and radicals about their watershed moments, what they've learned along the way, and how they maintain their hope on this path, dreaming and building emergent worlds for a present and future anchored in justice and freedom for all.
Because there are forks in the road, but they all lead us home, to the fight, to the build.
Thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed that, then you can help support the podcast on Patreon. All the support we get means a lot to us, and it really does help us grow this project. So that's patreon.com/12 Rules for What, and you can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Thanks a lot, and I will see you very soon.
12 Rules for What?